Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another session of the Global Foresight Summit. This year is organized by the APF, the World Futures Review, and Fast Forward. We have for this session Patricia Lustig and Gill Ringland. Patricia and Gill have written a number of books together as well as separately, and worked on projects together for clients from the European Commission to a train leasing company. Both of them previously held senior jobs in industry. This makes them unusual among futurists and led them to understand the importance of foresight, not just to futurists, but mostly to people with day jobs. To reach people with day jobs outside the foresight cycle, they blog regularly for Long Finance in their pamphlet series for projects, in addition to writing their books. I understand that in this session, they are going to give us a sneak preview of their next book, Amazing Green Suits. Just one point of housekeeping from me. Due to the number of people on this call, Patricia and Gill will be answering questions at the end, taken from the chat, read it on the live. So please do get on the chat as soon as a question occurs to you. Now, over to you, Patricia.
Thank you. Green Shoots is our next book. It's based on our research and global consultancy over the last decade and is aimed at a broad audience of people who are interested in using thinking about the future to improve decision-making. There are 3 reasons to read the book. If you are better informed, which the book aims to achieve, you'll be able to manage beyond uncertainty and improve the quality of your decisions, both for today and for the future. It will extend your imagination like science fiction does, helping you to envisage positive futures in the middle of the current doom and gloom. It will help you to challenge your and others' assumptions about people and our planet based on evidence that may surprise you. We look forward to sharing why it makes us optimistic about the future. In this short presentation, what we will do is think a little bit about managing beyond uncertainty and extending your imagination, and then we will spend some time discussing 5 examples of how we have explored and challenged existing paradigms. This illustrates the importance of being endlessly curious, and we are both endlessly curious. Uncertainty is a feeling you get when you face ambiguity. The better informed you are, the less discomfort you will feel because there is less ambiguity to feel uncomfortable about. If you understand which things you can influence and which you can't, you can focus on what you can do something about. You can decide to spend your time where it will have impact. Green Shoots is about the forces for change that exist in the world today. We share how they were formed and how they are changing and being disrupted today. These forces for change are facing disruptors like the COVID-19 pandemic, global warming, and technology. And we explain our optimism for the future by sharing stories, what we call snapshots, of people innovating, adapting, and navigating today's changes and disruptions from around the world. The snapshots are stories like the development of the many and various vaccines for COVID-19. You may already know some of this story, but we find it so striking a snapshot that we want to share it with you. The essential point is that vaccines were developed in 10 months instead of it taking 10 years. This was done through international cooperation and by researchers working with regulators to accelerate the regulatory system. Researchers quickly decoded and shared the genetic code of the virus. Many teams had one that they'd prepared earlier, an existing vehicle that could be used as a building block for a vaccine against almost any new virus. Laboratories threw the switch and temporarily dumped whatever they had been working on in order to develop the new COVID-19 vaccines. there was global collaboration among scientists. From the time the genetic code was shared, there was collaboration between different companies and between companies and universities in different countries. The paper detailing the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine has 600 authors listed. Governments were often involved in backing the vaccine development financially, for instance, by pre-ordering doses. Governments enabled fast tracking through their regulatory systems. And in 10 months, we achieved what had normally taken 10 years. Vaccines, not plural, that could help to control the disease. And that's why we use it as a model of what cooperation can achieve. Snapshots are one way of helping us to think about the future. They are useful because thinking about the future can be scary. It is unknown and we can't predict it. It is especially obvious today as we are facing multiple challenges. You can learn to think about the future in a useful way, one that helps you make better decisions for today and for tomorrow, and it needn't be scary. It is like learning a new skill or exploring a new world. We use the analogy of learning to scuba dive. As you might guess, we're both divers. When you dive, you enter a world very different from the one you are used to. You need to learn so many new things. How to breathe underwater. How to relate to being able to move in 3 dimensions since you're not stuck to the ground by gravity. Relating to the creatures and the seascape. Learning how to find your way. You need to learn how to deal with the risks, which you do by practicing the differing things that could go wrong and what you would need to do in each case until you can do them almost without thinking. By practicing, you learn how to survive, and as you get used to it, you begin to enjoy this strange new world. You can also borrow other people's imagination by using existing descriptions of futures through science fiction. You will find both utopian and dystopian examples, though I'm afraid there are more dystopian futures about. I prefer to look for the futures with interesting and positive aspects that aren't totally dystopian. I love exploring science fiction for the opportunity it gives me to catch glimpses of possible futures, and some frankly impossible ones as well. This can change the way that you view what is happening today, and it can open up possibilities for you, both through thinking about possibilities in that particular future that you might use today, as well as how you might achieve a future you like. We hope Green Shoots will extend your imagination in the way that Star Trek did for me. And now over to you, Jill.
I'm going to talk a bit about, and this echo is ridiculous. I wonder whether this is better. Hello? Is that better? So I'm going to talk I'm going to talk 5 examples of evidence to challenge assumptions to our current paradigm. And I wonder whether problems with the sound, whether Trish, if you can hear me, would you wave to me? Trish, can you hear me? Would you wave to me? Okay, thank you. So the first thing I want to talk about is the classic future shock by Heidi and Alvin Toffler. The second book is Humankind by Rutger Bregman. The third is the 1972 classic Limits to Growth by Don Meadows. The fourth book is Empty Planet by Darrell Bricker and John Ibbotson. And then there's this rather enigmatic heading, Trees. Under this heading, I'm going to be reporting on some calculations we did with a French professor on carbon capture by trees. Patricia and I met him in Montenegro at a conference dinner for the World Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was just back from an awards ceremony in Japan, When he told us about the award, we asked if he could help us think about carbon capture in trees. He immediately, with great delight, began scribbling on napkins, many napkins. So we'll come back to that later. And as an aside, you may actually notice that both Patricia and I have rather elegant leather jackets on. We bought them in Montenegro. It was an interesting trip. So starting with future shock. This has dominated assumptions about people's attitudes to the future for a long time. So it's, as the name suggests, the implication is that the future will be a shock. Well, the book was written by Alvin and Heidi Toffler. They were American futurists. Between 1965 and 1970, they interviewed hundreds of experts, corporate executives and senior professionals. They asked them about their concerns over the pace of change, their anxieties about adaptation, and their fears about the future. They came to two conclusions from these interviews. The first conclusion was that future shock is a real sickness from which increasingly large numbers of people were already suffering by 1970. Second, they realized how little was known about how people adapt to change. So we considered these conclusions when we were commissioned to write a chapter for the book Aftershock for the 50th anniversary of Future Shock. In the last 50 years, change has accelerated with technology having a reach beyond imaginable at the time that the Tofflers wrote. And it's not unreasonable that establishment people, experts, corporate executives, senior professionals could feel threatened. On the whole, Toffler's interviewees were older and well established. And the older you are, the more likely it is you'll feel threatened by change. We see it all the time now in people who didn't grow up with technology and can find it hard to adapt and do feel threatened. Some corners of society have indeed shown signs of the shattering stress and disorientation that the Tofflers speak about. But people develop through their generation and their experience. And when we look at the millennials and Generation Z, those born after 1980, they've grown up not only with technology, but also with the idea of continuous change. Compared to their parents, they're comfortable with it and have exhibited remarkable adaptation. They don't feel threatened anyway. Rather, many of them actually feel empowered by it. They effortlessly exploit the myriad technologies at their disposal in countless ways to connect with the world, often to the bemusement of their parents and teachers. In the book Green Shoes, we include many snapshots of Generation Z and millennials making things happen. So we think that people are more adaptable than the experts thought back in 1970. We think that humanity is doing better than Future Shock predicted. And particularly, we think that today's Generation Z and millennials are proving to be stellar in coping with the current speed of change. And now I'll hand over back to Patricia as she can pronounce the original title of the next book in Dutch.
De meeste mensen deugen, in Dutch, is about how, if you dig down into the facts, you find that most people are actually really pretty decent and want to do good. Many people base their... Pardon? Many people base their assumptions on things they read in newspaper headlines or novels. One novel which had a big impact was Lord of the Flies, about a gang of boys on a deserted island who became cannibals. Bregman shares an example of what really happens. He found a case of a group of Polynesian boys who borrowed a boat from a neighbor in 1977, got lost, and ended up on an island where they remained until found 15 months later. Unlike the boys in Lord of the Flies, they supported one another, helped one another to survive, and didn't end up eating anyone. Bregman also examines a number of famous experiments through going back to the original lab notebooks. When he analyzed the behavior of experimental subjects, they often turned out to be different to what the researchers had reported. He uses anthropology and zoology to argue that Homo sapiens evolution was based on our social skills and cooperation. We learned from each other better than the Neanderthals with their larger brains. Bregman calls us Homo puppy. We suggest you think about it. Think about what you've actually seen and experienced. If you look for decent behavior, you will find it. He is a good debunker of assumptions, and we agree with him. Over to you, Jill.
So this next slide is about limits to growth. Donna Meadows and her team were amazing. In 1972, using a very simple computer model, they came to some startling conclusions. They published their model and conclusions in the famous book Limits to Growth. Now, this graphic is from an Australian report in 2014, which reviewed the world in 2010 against the business as usual scenario from the original Limits to Growth. So using the graph to summarize and explore some of the output of the model, first, look at the yellow line and the khaki line. The yellow line is, it's a little bit difficult to see, but it is about food per person. And the prediction of the model was that this would collapse, that people would starve. Similarly, industrial output per person was going to collapse. Neither have happened. And in fact, the food per person is holding up extremely well because of the Green Revolution. Second, look at the green line, natural resources. This is a wake-up call. For instance, we know that biodiversity and water are two natural resources that are absolutely in crisis now. But it's the thinking on population, that's the blue line, that we wanted to talk about today. The limits to growth model was essentially that population would only fall as a result of starvation after a period of ever-increasing growth. We now know that population will fall based on choices made by women to limit the size of their families. With hindsight, it's easy to understand, since once people live in cities, they no longer need a large family to work on the land. They no longer need to have large numbers of children so that some survive. Many people have access to images and role models of small families through television and media. All this means that already today, many countries are experiencing population decline. So, wow, limits to growth. What an amazing piece of work. And their outputs from their model have shaped thinking for a generation. They made the assumptions in their model explicit, and these assumptions were of their time. So, luckily, scientists have turned out to be better able to change the agenda than Donna Meadows and her team thought, as in the Green Revolution. And luckily, people have turned out to be more resilient than the team thought and more likely to make choices, as the example of population shows. This slide picks up the theme of population again, and all of the lines represent predictions of the global population to the end of the century. You'll see they're all rather different. This is a bit worrying. The red line at the top is the UN prediction. It's used by many researchers and policymakers and shows increasing global population through to the end of the century. In contrast, the thick grey line is the predictions from the book Empty Planet, which we talked about. The authors argue that the global population is likely to top out at under about 9 billion in about 2050 and then decrease, using the same sort of thinking as we were using just now about women making choices. We've only got to look at the most recent demographics data from China to see that China will reach their peak population in a few years. And the birth rate's fallen, and the government's asking women to start having 3 children now. I think the answer is tending to be no, at least initially. And even in India, the fertility rate's close to 2.1, just enough for replacement. So the 3 other studies shown here are all from totally independent sources. So IIASA is a research center in Austria, and their model is the blue line, and they show population peaking in about 2070. Dr. Senye is the green line, and he was the Deutsche Bank chief economist when he published his analysis. He estimated a peak in about 2050 or 2060. And Randers is the same Jorgen Randers who published an updated version of Limits to Growth in 2004. He's suggesting a peak of about 8 billion in 2040, and that is the purple line. So what to make of all this? Well, our thinking is that the UN population projection now seems unlikely, so it's a pity that so many other forecasts rely on it. And finally, our trees. For several years, I had been asking anybody I could find who was a greenie or an expert how many trees were needed to capture the carbon emitted by the typical car commute to work. Was it 1 tree for 10 commuters, or was it 10 trees for 1 commuter? I couldn't get an answer until the meeting with our French colleague in Montenegro. And the calculation that we did was that for a car commute of about 5,000 kilometers a year, and a typical 1300 cc petrol car, the CO2 emissions would be about 650 kilograms per year. And the average net absorption per mature tree in temperate zones is about 30 kilograms of CO2 per year. So it would take a bit over 20 trees to compensate for our typical car commuter. And if you'd like to try your own calculation, I'll be putting a link to an online calculator onto the chat. So our conclusion from our calculation is that global warming can't be stopped by tree planting alone. But please do not stop planting trees. Urban trees are important in tackling pollution and in providing an environmentally good, a good environment for people. Forests are important for the global ecosystem. So please do not stop planting trees. So now I'll pass back to Patricia to wrap up.
Beyond uncertainty by helping you to be better informed. Like scuba diving, you learn to navigate in a new world. It will challenge you to extend your imagination, like science fiction, so you can see more opportunities. It will assist you to challenge your assumptions about people and the planet, based on evidence, leading to better decisions. It's rather more humankind than future shock. Our curiosity in research has led us to the conclusion that opportunities are there if we look for them. The world is full of creative and innovative people. We suspect that many in our audience are exactly so. This serves to make us optimistic about the future. Thank you, and please do visit us on the Global Megatrends website. So, sorry about that. Now over to questions that people might have. And Jill, you were going to have a look at that. Are you muted?
And I think if I'm not muted, I'm totally awful.
I can hear you.
Gill, you're mute.
So I can
mute. Okay.
I can speak when I can't hear, if you see what I mean. So I think probably the best thing, since this is such a difficult situation, I'd better hand over to you, Trish, and maybe we could offer to answer the questions in the chat later. I'm just not quite sure how best to handle this technology, which is not helping.
This. I will have a look and see if I can see anything in the comments. Okay, hang on. I'm just looking for any questions in here, so please forgive me. So I think, Jill, this is, do the forecast take into account people spending time on their phones instead of procreating?
I think that could be the significant difference between the United Nations projections and the others. Don't you?
Patricia, Gill, you are both mute. So
I'm sorry about that. I've got only one screen that's working, and it's not where the video is. Long-term modeling have some odds recognized by those who participated in the Rome Club study. Can you use other tools to reach and understand the future? Well, the answer to that is yes. There are lots of different tools that you can use, rather depending on what you're looking for and who you're working with. And there are lots of things like existing scenarios that have been shared online that you could use to examine and think about different futures. Let's see what else. Are there any patterns in the green shoots you see as most promising? Governments, private sector, entrepreneurs, individuals, organizations, communities, etc. Would you like to do that one, Jill?
Yes. I mean, we see that there is so much social change going on that all sorts of organizations that are difficult to name because they're networked, they have their own dynamic, are starting to be incredibly powerful, right across the world. And so, one example is the Black Lives Matter movement, totally outside government, and with many more non-white, non-blacks than blacks in it, and organizing protests all over the world. Similarly, we see in some Eastern European countries that the use of social media orchestrated from another country allows protests to take place with tens of thousands of people, whereas previously it would only be 1,000 or so. So we think that technology and people's attitude is changing the way people start to think about the world they want.
Okay, and I have a question here about, we talked about snapshots and what was our favorite snapshot, and I can only speak for myself about a favorite snapshot. It's actually quite an old one, and it's called Positive Deviance. It's a story about a village in Vietnam. It's about 25 years ago, and they were studying malnutrition. There was a lot of malnutrition in the town, in a little village, and they were studying why there was a difference between all these little children, none of whom really had enough to eat, and there were some that were better nourished than others. So they had a look around to see what exactly it was that people were doing. What was different between the ones who are better nourished than the others. And it turned out that those who were better nourished, their parents were catching little freshwater shrimps and feeding them in the rice, and that additional source of protein improved the nourishment of the children. And they shared this with the rest of the village, and everybody started doing it. And it's a way of kind of a snapshot, sharing a snapshot and getting a lot of benefit from it by doing so. And I think we're at the end of our time, if I'm correct, Fran?
Yeah, we don't have time for more. So thank you so much, Gill. Thank you so much, Patricia, for being with us.
And thank you for the question.
Indeed, thanks very much for your help.
Thank you, everyone, for watching us, too. We are back in 5 minutes with the next session with Jaime and Caterina from the CNID in Chile. So, yeah, we'll see all of you in a bit. Thank you, everyone. See you. Bye.